All right, guys, welcome back to the TCI studio. Alex and I are going to give you guys, we're going out on the limb, see the limbs hanging around on the green screen. We're going to go out on the limb and give you our way too early, although it's not as early now, predictions on the college football playoff.
And this is a raw reaction to what we feel like is going to happen.
We're going to replay this during the season. You guys can see whether we're on the money or not. We'll maybe come back and play this in early December and see. Well, I'm sure we'll be all over it. The nice thing is, covering Clemson, we can do this every year.
Right.
And Clemson is always going to be in there every year, at least for me. I think from Alex as well. So it's great to be able to do this. So we're sitting here in late June, and we're talking about, okay, who's going to be in the playoff this year and who is Clemson going to have to battle. Obviously, Alex, we did a segment earlier this week where we talked about the 12-team playoff and how that's going to change things, but we also talked about how Clemson, Alabama, and Ohio State are still probably going to be there every year.
Right.
I guess I'll start off asking you, do you think any of those three teams will not make it this year?
It's hard for me to say that they won't, but at the same time, all three of those programs are going to be under different leadership at quarterback. They're going to look a little bit different. It's not going to be the same teams that you saw last year. And if watching college football for my whole life has taught me anything, it doesn't really matter how much you say about somebody coming out of high school. Sometimes when they get under the lights and center in a big game, they're completely different. So it'll be interesting to see if all of those highly touted young quarterbacks end up being as strong as they were, end up getting the teams to be as strong as they were last year. But I still can't see.
So you think all three of those will be there?
I really do. I mean, I don't see anybody in the Big Ten that could beat Ohio State, because Ohio State has built under Ryan Day. I really feel like they've built a program really similarly to the way that Clemson and Alabama have built their programs to be. Somebody leaves and there's somebody that's right behind them to step up. And he's that kind of motivator and that kind of coach in his locker room that can get a younger player to play like a junior or a senior. So I can't see Ohio State really falling in the Big Ten. And then Alabama is probably the one that I would say maybe is in more danger.
See, you're going to my next question already. I was going to ask you, of those three, which do you think is the most likely to not make it?
Yeah, I think you would have to say that it's Alabama just because of the schedule that they're going to have to play. Because it's not like, as much as I hate to say it, and it sounds very cliche, who's Ohio State going to run into in the Big Ten that's going to give them fits? Clemson isn't going to run into anybody until probably the ACC championship game in conference that's going to give them a run for their money. Georgia could come out week one and beat Clemson by 3 touchdowns and it wouldn't matter maybe.
Well, let's talk about let's take that to another level. First off, I do agree with you. I expect Clemson, Ohio State, Alabama, all three to make it. I also agree with you that Alabama is probably the one, if one of those three doesn't make it, that's the most likely. And let's take that back, talk more about Alabama. Who are the teams that could knock them out? I think one of the teams that could knock them out, and the team that could actually have the season where they get back to the playoff and do some things they want to do. Obviously, they've been to the playoff before, but they haven't won the championship. The team Clemson plays right off the chute. Georgia, I think, might be Alabama's biggest challenge.
Yeah, I think Georgia certainly could be Alabama's biggest challenge, because the two teams almost complement each other, because Georgia has the older, veteran, experienced quarterback in JT Daniels. Obviously, he hasn't played in the same kind of games that he's going to be playing at Georgia this year, or played in a game like he's going to be playing in on September 4th. But they have the older, experienced quarterback. They have the salty defensive line. Alabama loses a bunch of pieces, and they've got a sophomore young quarterback, Bryce Young. So it'll be interesting to see what they do if they're able to live up to that grind of an SEC schedule. Texas A&M, we've seen them kind of trending upwards under Jimbo Fisher. So it wouldn't totally shock me. I mean, we've seen Alabama do this before, where they'll lose to a team that's below their caliber. But I think there are a few teams in that conference that could make a run at Alabama.
I think the piece you talked about there, Georgia with the experienced quarterback coming back, Alabama with the inexperienced quarterback, we're going to see what they can do there. And, I think Ohio State, too, if they were to stumble somewhere, it's probably going to be because the quarterback doesn't quite live up to what they saw from Justin Fields. And we don't know that answer yet. With these young quarterbacks coming in. In fact, I'd go as far as to say, if you look at Clemson, Ohio State, and Alabama, and you're looking at the team leader in the quarterback position, I think if you're Clemson, you got to feel better than the other two about what you got.
Right. Yeah, you definitely feel better about it because you got to see him in a big game, and you got to see him in a close game where he had to come from behind and win. So you got to see him in the prime time, top 5 game day type matchup at Notre Dame, and then you got to see him really have to scrap and bring Clemson from behind to beat a Boston College team that was playing out of their mind on a Saturday in Death Valley. So I think Clemson definitely feels the best about having an inexperienced young quarterback because you still got to see him play 2 whole games where he was taking meaningful snaps. It wasn't like he just played against
the top 4 Notre Dame team
to the
to
wire.
overtime.
Yeah, and it wasn't like
Notre Dame.
It wasn't like he just went in and played against
Yep.
FCS team. He went in and was playing against the best of the best, and then a team that also I think is trending up in the ACC in Boston College with a really good quarterback and I think a good coach as well.
All right, so we got the
yeah.
3. We all agree there's some chances something would happen there. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Clemson-Georgia game as well before we get off to, who's going to be number 4.
Give you some
Will,
suspense.
We'll give you a little suspense. That's a tease. Will and I have talked about this several times, but, if you're Clemson and you lose that Georgia game, it's going to be harder for you to feel confident that you'll still be in the playoffs. If you're Georgia and you lose that Clemson game, you know that if you run the table and win the SEC championship, you're going to be in the playoff.
Right.
If you're the ACC champ and you have a loss, you're probably going to be there, but not definitely going to be there, especially with all the narrative that the national media likes to create about the ACC, and we've talked about the schedule ourselves. If you're Clemson, you really need to win that first game, and if you do, you're there.
Yeah.
If you're Georgia, you lose that first game, you can still be there, just win your division, win the SEC championship.
Yeah, I really can't think of a time, definitely not a time in Clemson football where the first game of the season has been as meaningful as it is this year. I guess probably the most meaningful first game for Clemson since before this was also against Georgia in 1982. That was probably the only game that in Clemson's history you really had to compare the significance going into this game, because that's ultimately one of the things that kept Clemson from being able to compete for another title again. But Clemson, like you said, they have to beat Georgia in order to be in control of their own destiny. If Clemson doesn't beat Georgia, then it's not in control of its own destiny unless, some other teams flounder. Yeah. Which I will say, going into this year, it's not as clear-cut as it was last year. Last year, at the beginning of the season, well, with all the COVID stuff, it was a little confusing. But besides that, you could look at the teams in college football and say, these are the teams that are going to be there. These are a few teams that are going to compete, and it pretty much was chalk. Yep. This year, with those young quarterbacks and with some other programs not getting to get a good sample size last year because of all the COVID restrictions and all the in-conference play, this year it's not as clear-cut as it was a year ago.
Well, let's talk about some of those other teams. All right, we've got our 3. First off, who's your pick for number 4, and who do you think that maybe the top 2 or 3 teams are that'll be competing for that 4th spot?
Yeah, I think my 4, I'm going to go with Oklahoma, Spencer Rattler. I'm not on the Spencer Rattler bandwagon as much as everybody else is. I know that he got a lot of hype last year. I just didn't see him impacting games in the way that a highly touted quarterback should. And I know that's a really super high standard, but we've seen it firsthand how much a highly touted quarterback can influence a team, can influence a program. And Spencer Rattler didn't necessarily show me that last year. So I still have them picked as number 4. I know he's in the top 3 in every Heisman list. He's the Heisman favorite for some people. I'm not completely sold on Oklahoma, but right now I would have to pick Oklahoma as number 4.
All right, who do you think is going to be battling with them for that?
Well, I think Georgia's definitely going to be battling for that 4th spot.
The second SEC team.
If Georgia beats Clemson, they don't have to win the SEC championship game to make it into the college football playoff. I mean, unless Oklahoma goes undefeated.
No,
Unless all those teams go undefeated.
That's a great part of that discussion.
Then
if
if
Georgia
Georgia
beats Clemson, Alabama wins the SEC, that makes it that much harder for Clemson to get in there.
Yeah, if Georgia goes and beats Clemson, then they would have to have a really bad day to not make the college football playoff, in my opinion.
Yep.
So I think they're definitely that next team that's right behind Oklahoma that's going to be competing.
I think that's a great point with Georgia, especially if they beat Clemson. I'm not as sold on Oklahoma. Some of what you said, I just, quarterback position, what wasn't last year, what it's been. Obviously, he played better later in the year. The big question there is there anybody else in that conference that's ready to step up and has enough talent to beat them? A lot of people think, Texas is going to come and do it every year. I'm going to have to see that to believe it. We just haven't seen it. I think it might be a year where the Pac-12 has a team that runs the table, maybe Oregon. So they might be able to have a team that's more in that conversation. So again, all of these things, if you're Clemson, you can't lose that Georgia game because there's a lot of things that can really stack up against you. If not, if I had to predict, I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say Clemson, Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia are the playoff teams. I'm going to say Georgia gets in over Oklahoma, but I agree with you. I think they'll be battling there. I think whoever's the Pac-12 champ, if they can run the table, they'll be in the conversation. If they have a loss, probably won't be in that conversation.
Well, also with the Pac-12, I know obviously the Pac-12 hasn't competed for a title in the CFP era since those bookend really good Oregon teams, the team that went and whooped Jameis Winston in his senior year or junior year. But I think we didn't get a good look at the Pac-12 last year because of their limited schedule, because of them deciding at the very last minute that they were going to play football in the fall. We didn't get a good sample of the Pac-12 last year, and the players didn't get a good chance to prepare for the season. So I think, honestly, some of those Pac-12 teams last year that maybe even looked mediocre or slightly above average are just kind of good, like in Oregon. Oregon, and they looked great at times, they looked horrible at times.
Which the Pac-12 hasn't had. They had they've got a coach that obviously comes from SEC roots, and they had a really quality defense. They've recruited really well out there on the defensive side. So, the question is, will they have enough at offense to make them competitive enough to be able to run the table?
Yeah, I think this is definitely a year that we could see the Pac-12 making it into the playoff. Still waiting on the Pac-12 to really compete for a championship in the CFP. They've made it into the playoff, but haven't seen the Pac-12 compete for a championship since that Oregon team. But I'm interested to see what the Pac-12 looks like this year. I'm really just excited to have a real college football season this year with all the teams playing all the games, playing each other across conference instead of just doing this, inter-conference thing that we witnessed last year. I'm excited to see real football. And that Ohio State-Oregon matchup is going to be
huge.
Huge.
It'll be great to see, like you said.
And it's going to be a litmus test for both of those teams to see if they have what it takes. Ohio State with a young quarterback, Oregon unproven, if they have what it takes to make it to the college football playoff.
And that's a great point. If Oregon loses that and they do run the table in the Pac-12, still gonna have a hard time getting in.
Or if Oregon comes out and plays like world beaters, or Ohio State has a bad day at quarterback.
See ya. All right. So if you've learned one thing from this video, it is what? Clemson needs to beat Georgia.
Yes.
Right.
The Clemson Georgia game. I mean, I don't think that I can stress to you anymore the magnitude of the Clemson Georgia game this year, and it's exciting to see two traditional rivals that don't get to play as much as they should. I really think Clemson and Georgia should play every year, meeting back up in a high-stakes game.
Totally disagree with you. Will and I argue on this all the time, and you guys know on the board, it is a great rivalry, yada, yada, yada. All of those things are true, but because of exactly what we're talking about here, if you're Clemson in the playoff era, you don't need to play them in the regular season.
As a fan of the sport and somebody that grew up in and around Clemson, I want to see Clemson play Georgia.
But if Clemson loses that game on September 3rd or 4th, then the rest of the season is not going to be the same and it's not going to be near as much fun because Clemson fans are going to be biting their fingernails the whole season, wondering can they get in the playoff.
It sure beats playing Ball State or UConn, though.
No, but if you play Ball State and you're sitting there number 2 or number 3 in the playoff, and you know you're going to win the ACC and go to the playoff, then you can play Georgia or Alabama. So definitely different opinions here. Will and I have different opinions on that as well. I understand the rivalry piece of it, but for me, it's all about getting in the playoff and winning the playoff. But we're going to find out. The game's on the schedule. 2 of the top, probably 3 teams in the country, definitely 2 of the top 4, 5 teams in the country are going to face off in Charlotte. I'm glad it's not in Atlanta.
Amen.
So a lot to cover. We got a lot to build up, and we'll have a heck of a lot to talk about once that game is over. So hopefully you guys get a feel, hopefully start to get excited, start to get some what ifs going around in your head on this season. Hopefully we'll have packed stadiums. We'll be back to normal. Everything will be what we want from a football perspective. Thanks for tuning in. Stay tuned to the Clemson Insider. We'll have the most complete coverage of Clemson football, Clemson recruiting, and Clemson athletics.